So we represented a young man named John, a very nice guy, affable personality, lights up a room. John was hired as a independent contractor for a moving company to move goods around locally and across state lines. And John was a passenger in this truck that was overloaded on their way back from a trip. And the truck driver was proceeding at an excessive speed around a curve in this mountainous road, and the truck flipped. Unfortunately, John was ejected from the passenger seat and wound up in a ditch.
It was an accident that John really had nothing to do with. I mean, John was hired mainly to move furniture in and out of the truck, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, he has no control over the route. He had no control over the driving. And he certainly had no control over the maintenance of the truck. So when we started looking at the case, of course, we're thinking about all those things. We figured out pretty quick, I think, that the driver was at fault because the police officer had given him a citation. But then it took a little more digging to find some of the other problems. We found hired an accident reconstruction expert who, in addition to going out to the scene of the collision, and like looking at the tire marks, as everybody knows, and evaluating the vehicles, also go look at the crashed car. So the truck was in a lot somewhere. Graham figured out where it was.
Way up there in the sticks. Went out and looked at the truck. I looked at it first and found a bunch of physical evidence related to what was going on at the time. Also found a couple of pieces of paper, some bills of lading that were very, very instrumental in helping us determine who was who in this whole shell operation.
What's a bill of lading?
A bill of lading is effectively an invoice or a contract receipt reflecting services provided and the costs thereof provided by an entity to a customer to reflect what procedures and services were done.
So it sounds like fault on the driver was pretty clear. So what other issues were there in the case?
Good question. Yeah, the driver's fault was clear, but we also thought that there was some liability on behalf of the moving company by virtue of the fact that they sent this driver on this knowingly dangerous stretch in an overloaded vehicle that had maintenance issues. And because of vicarious liability, they were responsible for the actions and the negligence of their driver.
There's also a problem with one of the brakes. It's just standard stuff. Like when you have a vehicle, even like me and this old pickup truck, I have an obligation under Georgia law to keep the brakes in a reasonable working order because I'm the owner. Well, if you're driving a commercial motor vehicle, you have that regular obligation under Georgia law, but also a whole bunch more under the federal motor carrier safety regulations. You have to maintain a truck, and they just weren't doing it. It was a shady moving company, and they weren't spending the money to even keep the brakes up.
So I saw you filed suit against 7 different companies. Tell me about that and how all those companies are connected together and why it's significant.
Well, it was quite a task to determine who all was responsible. It really was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. We started with the police report which identified one of the companies, I believe it was Universal Moving, as the owner of the vehicle. There were also markings on the truck which reflected that company. Subsequently, when we turned up a search on the Secretary of State's website for that entity and nothing came back, we did a little further digging, and that's when I referenced those bills of lading, which in the truck itself, I recovered 2 separate bills of lading for 2 separate entities that held themselves out as moving companies. And at that point, I realized that we were possibly dealing with a shell operation, and we were going to have to do some further digging.
Yeah, Graham did more of that than I did by far, but we talked about it some, and I did a little bit of it. It involved a whole lot of digging on the Secretary of State's website. I think a lot of people don't know this, but if you want to legally create a company, you do so through the Secretary of State, of whatever state you're operating in, Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, Alaska. And typically you can find out some information about a company through the Secretary of State's website. It should list a registered agent, which is where you would serve process on the company, sometimes a few other things. So we dug through that. About half the companies had active listings with the Secretary of State, about half didn't. Some of them were in other states. I think Graham figured out there were a couple of brothers running the show from Florida.
Yeah, so the common denominator were the owners or registered agents in our database searches, our background checks, our open records requests, certificate of occupancy for various properties that were listed as being owned by the various entities. The common denominator were this set of brothers, and I believe their father was involved as well, running this operation out of Florida, and they had entities from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Florida, Georgia. Those were just the ones that we uncovered.
Yeah, right. I mean, there's probably more than we found.
So by doing all this, you uncovered an insurance policy that covered the accident in the truck.
Well, we were able to identify one commercial insurance policy covering one of the entities. Before we got into that sort of coverage, though, we had to determine whether or not this case would have been barred by what's known as the workers' compensation bar to recovery. In Georgia, workers' compensation law states that employers are required to carry workers' compensation insurance to compensate injured workers and pay them benefits. By virtue of that law, employers directly are typically precluded from being pursued directly in litigation. It's set up such that they are injured parties are required to go through the workers' compensation insurance system, and because of that, oftentimes an injured employee cannot recover directly from their employer. So we had to first identify if we were going to have an issue in that regard. Through further legwork and digging, we were able to determine by checking pay stubs, interviewing co-workers, and conducting numerous other searches, tax records, open records requests, all sorts of stuff. Business licenses. We found out that, in fact, and we applied the workers' compensation test. There's a framework that applies with a number of different questions concerning the time, manner, and method of control that an employer has over an independent contractor. Ultimately, what we were able to determine was that our client, John, was able to sue the moving companies directly because he was not, in fact, an employee, but rather an independent contractor of these moving companies.
I think a lot of people don't realize that there's almost two parallel systems of tort law, or well, not tort law, but personal injury law. There's tort cases like our firm brings, which we call a real court, and then there's the parallel workers' compensation system. And Georgia, like most states, I think all, says that an employee cannot sue his or her employer for injuries sustained on the job. And the employers love that because if they get sued in the workers' compensation system, they don't have to pay as much money.
There's less exposure generally in workers' compensation than there is in personal injury.
Yeah, but if me and Graham get after them, they're going to have to pay a lot more. So they're always trying to say, no, this is a workers' compensation matter. So we were trying to get ahead of that. And that's why it helped to show that John was an independent contractor and therefore wasn't precluded or prevented from suing in a real court because the workers' compensation rules didn't apply.
But getting back to your question about coverage, we were, after we got past the workers' comp issue, we were able to determine that there was a commercial policy of insurance that covered one of the defendant moving companies to the tune of a $750,000 policy. Some of the policy had been eroded due to a property damage claim made by the owners of the furniture that was destroyed in the wreck. But we were able to successfully apply that coverage to John's damages and injuries. But there was another little hitch when we fast forward 6 months after this wreck.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So was it, I think you called me on New Year's Eve. Was that the day? Yeah. So on New Year's Eve, 2020, our client was found deceased in his hotel room. And, you know, Lord, your heart goes out to the family, right? They've already been dealing with this. And then, I mean, we kind of thought he would make a full recovery. Sometimes medicine is strange. I mean, sometimes you don't recover when people think you will. And we all thought he would pull through, but they found out on New Year's Eve, and we found out later in the day that wasn't going to happen.
So from that point on, what happened with the case was we switched gears and pursued the case as a wrongful death case.
Right.
At that point, we had determined everything we needed from a liability standpoint. Causation and damages were obviously there. So we proceeded to send a demand to the insurer for the moving company. And they hardly hesitated and shortly thereafter tendered the remaining policy limits.
Yeah, we got all of it. But the sort of, I guess, the synopsis on the fly-by-night trucking industry is that it happens an awful lot. You'll have some dude who sets up a small trucking company and claims to be, a big deal, starts hauling freight. Well, if something goes wrong and gets caught violating a rule, they may not even fix it. Shut down one company and start another one and do it over and over again. These brothers done it so many times, they had at least 7 different companies. We sued 7. Hell, it could have been more. But when you see something like that, the challenge from a legal perspective is to find the money, because it doesn't do our clients any bit of good to sue some company that now only exists on paper. And it maybe doesn't own a truck, maybe never owned a truck because they rented the darn thing. So the real challenge that we faced and that Graham really took lead on solving was sorting through all the paperwork and all the names and figuring out where the money was.
How does a successful outcome in a difficult case like this make you feel?
Well, it's difficult for a number of reasons, namely because our client, John, we lost him. And,
He was a good dude.
Just like I say, he lit up a room, and his family are super nice. I mean, just the model the model American citizens, and we can't bring John back, but hopefully the compensation we are able to obtain will at least help to alleviate the pain and the loss that they experienced. For me personally, it really is satisfying to know that I did everything that I could to pursue this case to the limits and get as much money as possible for our client, and we feel grateful that we were able to represent John.
I don't believe I can improve on that.